Welcome to the Cheating Confession Reddit channel. Today, I'm going to share with you a real-life cheating story. It will give you a better understanding of the issue of infidelity today and help you be more cautious when it comes to a cheating wife. Let's dive into this story together.
The grand ballroom throbbed with vibrant energy, a jubilant testament to the 25 years Nolan and Kimberly had spent together. Friends and family filled the expansive hall, their voices blending into a harmonious symphony of celebration. Nolan lingered by the bar, a glass of scotch cradled in his hand, silently taking in the scene. Parties weren't his usual preference, but tonight was different, a milestone that demanded recognition. A faint, almost wistful smile crossed his face as his eyes roamed the crowd. Somewhere amid the clusters of cheerful guests, Kimberly was in her element, dazzling as always in social gatherings. The bartender motioned toward his drink. "Top you off, Mr. Nolan?" He shook his head gently. "Not just yet. Thanks." His gaze eventually landed on Kimberly. She was radiant in her silver gown, the fabric catching the light and making her appear almost ethereal. She stood close to Sylvester, his oldest friend from their college days, their heads inclined in animated conversation. The sight gave him pause. His smile wavered as Kimberly's laughter rang out, her hand lightly touching Sylvester's arm. There was nothing overtly inappropriate, but an inexplicable unease gnawed at him. Unable to shake the feeling, he found himself drawn toward them. Navigating the crowd with practiced grace, he made his way closer, nodding at familiar faces along the way. He stopped just short of interrupting them, positioning himself discreetly behind a lavish floral arrangement to overhear their exchange. "Can you believe he still thinks they're his kids?" Kimberly's voice was low, her tone tinged with mischief. Nolan froze, the glass in his hand suddenly feeling heavier. Sylvester's laughter followed, deep and unhurried. "He's practically funded their whole lives," Sylvester said, his tone amused. "Education, trips, the works. Honestly, it couldn't have been planned better." The words struck Nolan like a physical blow. His breath faltered as he processed their meaning. Kimberly's lips curled into a sly smile. "I know," she murmured, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And he's so oblivious. It's almost sweet." Before the full weight of their betrayal could settle, a familiar voice interrupted. Melody, his eldest daughter, sidled up to them with a champagne flute in hand. She leaned in, speaking just loud enough for their group to hear. "Uncle Sylvester's way cooler than Dad anyway. Honestly, he's such a loser." Nolan's knees nearly buckled. Melody? His Melody? The daughter he had adored, coached through soccer games and walked to school? The air seemed to leave his lungs as he stumbled back, retreating into the bustling crowd, their cruel words reverberating in his mind. He moved mechanically, his expression carefully neutral despite the turmoil within. The ballroom, once a place of celebration, now felt suffocating. Reaching the center of the room, his eyes locked onto the stage and its microphone. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but it quickly dissipated. He knew what he had to do. Climbing the steps, he tapped the microphone, commanding the room's attention. The hum of conversation faded as all eyes turned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nolan began, his voice steady though his heart thundered. "Thank you for coming tonight to honor 25 years of marriage. Unfortunately, the celebration ends here. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the party is over. Please make your way home." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Guests exchanged puzzled glances, whispers filling the silence. Kimberly, still standing with Sylvester and Melody, froze mid-laugh. Her expression shifted to one of alarm as she processed his words. "Nolan!" she called, stepping forward. "What's going on?" He didn't respond, simply setting the microphone down and walking past her. She reached for him, her hand brushing his arm, but he shrugged her off with a quiet firmness. "Nolan, wait!" she pleaded, her voice rising, but he was already gone. The drive home was consumed by silence. The road ahead blurred as memories of their conversation replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. By the time he reached their house, his decision was clear. In the solitude of his study, he spent the night combing through financial records, account statements, and the prenuptial agreement he hadn't thought about in decades. Fueled by cold resolve, he worked methodically through the night. By dawn, he had a plan. The next morning, Kimberly found him in the kitchen, sipping coffee as though it were any other day. She lingered in the doorway, her face pale, her voice hesitant. "Nolan, can we talk about last night? What happened? Why did you end the party?" He placed the mug down deliberately, fixing her with a piercing stare. The silence stretched until she fidgeted under its weight. "What happened?" he repeated, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "I heard everything, Kimberly. Every single word." Her face drained of color. I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his voice rising. "I heard you. I heard Sylvester. I heard Melody. 25 years, Kimberly. 25 years of lies. You let me believe those kids were mine while carrying on with my best friend?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. He pressed on, his tone hardening with each word. "Don't bother denying it. You've had your fun. Now it's my turn." Tears filled her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, grabbing his coat. "I'll be in touch through my lawyer." "Nolan, please," she cried, reaching for him. "Don't do this. Let's talk. We can fix this." He paused at the door, casting one last glance over his shoulder. His expression was a mixture of pity and contempt. "You don't fix 25 years of deceit, Kimberly. You end it." And with that, he was gone. By midday, Nolan sat in his lawyer's office, a thick folder of documents spread across the desk. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his gaze measured. "You're absolutely certain about this?" Without hesitation, Nolan nodded. "File the papers. Immediately. I need to update my will. Not a single dime will go to the children." The lawyer's eyebrows arched. "That's quite a drastic move, Nolan. Are you absolutely sure?" "Completely," Nolan interrupted him sharply. "They're not mine. They never were." The lawyer nodded, his pen swiftly scrawling notes. "Understood." "Sell it all," Nolan continued with a cold edge. "The house, the cars, the stocks, everything. Liquidate it and transfer the proceeds to a private account under my new name." The lawyer leaned back, visibly intrigued by Nolan's determination. "You've clearly given this a lot of thought," he remarked. "Not really," Nolan replied curtly. "I made up my mind last night." That evening he moved silently through the house, a shadow among the memories. He packed a small bag, purposefully avoiding the family portraits on the walls. The faint echoes of past laughter felt like cruel taunts. At the front door he froze. Kimberly stood there, tears streaming down her face. "Nolan, please," she implored. "Don't do this. We need you. The kids need you." His expression was unreadable. "You needed me years ago," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Now you need Sylvester. Go to him." Without another word, he stepped into the night and disappeared. Kimberly sank into the living room chair, clutching a half-empty glass of wine, her hands trembling. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, casting heavy, elongated shadows. The oppressive silence filled the house, a stark contrast to the joyful gathering that had taken place only days before. The children were scattered around the room, their faces a mix of anger and confusion. Melody, the eldest, broke the tense quiet. "Mom, what's going on? Dad cancels the party and just vanishes? What did you do?" Kimberly's eyes widened. "What do you mean, what did I do? I have no idea why he left." Her voice wavered, betraying her attempt to sound composed. Michael, the middle child, leaned against the couch, arms folded tightly. "Dad doesn't just up and leave. He's never done anything like this before. Did you two have a fight? Did something happen at the party?" Kimberly hesitated, her thoughts racing. She couldn't reveal what Nolan might have overheard. The truth would shatter them, or more specifically their image of her. "I think he's just overwhelmed," she said weakly, avoiding their eyes. "He probably needs time to clear his head. He'll come back." Melody's gaze hardened. "Taking time to think? That doesn't explain why his car's gone, his phone's off, or why half his closet is empty. Stop lying." Before Kimberly could answer, the front door opened. Sylvester walked in, holding a grocery bag and a bottle of wine. He paused, surveying the tense atmosphere. "What's with all the long faces?" he asked lightly. Michael shot him a glare. "Dad's gone. Nobody knows where he is." Sylvester's smile flickered briefly before he recovered. "He's probably just taking a breather," he said, trying to sound casual. "You know how he gets sometimes. Always working, never resting." Setting the groceries down, he moved closer to Kimberly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll sort this out," he said softly. Kimberly recoiled slightly but nodded. "Yes, he just needs some space." Melody sprang to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "Space? That's your excuse? This isn't some midlife crisis. Something happened and you're hiding it from us." She stormed off, slamming her bedroom door behind her. Sylvester sighed and sat beside Kimberly. "They'll cool off. Just give them a little time." Kimberly stared into her wine glass, her voice barely a whisper. "What if he never comes back? What if he knows?" Sylvester's confident demeanor faltered. "If he does know, we'll handle it," he said, attempting to sound assured, but the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. As days passed, the unease grew heavier. One morning, Kimberly's phone rang. The family's financial advisor spoke with a grave tone. "Kimberly, I've been trying to reach Nolan, but his accounts are closed. Every joint account with your name has been emptied. His assets have been liquidated or moved." Kimberly's stomach dropped. "That can't be. He couldn't take everything." "I'm sorry," the advisor replied, "but it seems he planned this meticulously. There's nothing left." Her hands shook as she ended the call. How had Nolan dismantled their lives so completely, so quickly? Why hadn't she seen it coming? She rushed into the kitchen where Sylvester sat sipping coffee. "He took everything," she said, panic thick in her voice. Sylvester frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The accounts," she said breathlessly. "They're empty. The house, the investments, all gone. We have nothing left." Sylvester ran a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Nolan," he muttered. He stood, pacing the room. "Okay, don't panic. We'll figure this out." Kimberly grabbed his arm. "How? The mortgage, the bills, the kids' tuition. How are we supposed to survive without him?" He pulled away, rubbing his temples. "We'll think of something. Maybe I can get a loan. We'll find a way." Kimberly's voice cracked with a volatile mix of anger and desperation as she confronted Sylvester. "On my own? Are you serious right now, Sylvester? Do you have any idea how deep in debt we are? It's like we're drowning out here." Before Sylvester could muster a reply, the sharp sound of approaching footsteps signaled Melody's arrival. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression cold and unyielding. "Oh, great. So Uncle Sylvester's involved too?" Melody's voice dripped with sarcasm. "What other delightful secrets are you hiding from us, Mom?" Kimberly's composure faltered, her tone shifting to a trembling plea as she faced her daughter. "Melody, it's not what you think. I'm trying to make sense of everything to fix this mess." But Melody shook her head, her frustration cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't pretend, Mom. You're not being honest. There's something you're keeping from us. Something you're not saying. Whatever you and Uncle Sylvester have been up to, it's on you." Kimberly's voice dropped to a whisper, stricken. "How can you say that, Melody?" "Because it's true!" Melody's words came out like a whip. "Dad wouldn't have made those decisions without you pushing him into it. And Uncle Sylvester? Him being around all the time is just weird. Don't expect me to ignore that." Kimberly opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her silence was broken by Sylvester, who stepped forward with a steady yet commanding tone. "That's enough, Melody. Your mom has enough to deal with. Throwing accusations doesn't help anyone." Melody's glare only hardened, her voice icy. "You're not my dad, Sylvester. Don't think for a second you can tell me what to do." Turning sharply, she stormed out, leaving behind an oppressive silence that hung in the room. As the weeks passed, the tension in the household only grew heavier. The pile of unpaid bills became insurmountable, and the unrelenting calls from creditors echoed like grim reminders of their mounting failures. What had once been a grand mansion, a symbol of prosperity, now felt like a suffocating cage. Kimberly's children barely spoke to her, their rare words steeped in bitterness. One bleak morning, Kimberly sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held an ominous letter. She read it aloud, her voice hollow and cracking. "The house is being foreclosed." Sylvester, seated nearby and distracted by his phone, snapped to attention. "What did you say?" "We have 30 days," she repeated, the weight of those words pressing down on her. "We have to leave." Cursing under his breath, Sylvester ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "No, no, this can't be happening." Kimberly's teary eyes fixed on him. "You said we'd find a way through this. What are we supposed to do now? Where are we going to go?" Without answering, Sylvester rose abruptly and grabbed his jacket. "I need some air. I'll figure it out." Kimberly watched him leave, the weight of her crumbling world pressing down harder. Betrayal, resentment from her children, and now the loss of their home bore down on her like an avalanche. She buried her face in her hands, her tears falling freely. By the end of the month, the house was empty. Movers carried out furniture and boxed remnants of a life now gone. Kimberly stood on the front lawn, numb, as her life was dismantled piece by piece. Her children stayed out of sight, their absence another painful reminder of her failings. Kimberly and Sylvester oversaw the final steps in silence, the weight of their shared failure palpable. When the last moving truck pulled away, Kimberly turned to Sylvester, her voice devoid of hope. "What do we do now?" Sylvester hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I've been thinking," he began carefully. "Maybe we should go our separate ways." Kimberly's breath caught. "You're leaving? After everything?" Shifting uncomfortably, Sylvester avoided her eyes. "Kimberly, I can't fix this. I don't have the resources. And honestly, this isn't what I signed up for." Her legs gave out and she reached for his arm to steady herself. "You can't just abandon me. You promised, Sylvester." Gently but firmly, he pulled away. "I didn't promise anything. I'm sorry. You'll find a way." Without another word, he walked to his car and drove off, leaving her behind, alone with nothing but the wreckage of her life. That night, Kimberly sat in a dingy motel room with her children. The silence between them was stifling, as heavy as the air in the tiny space. Finally, Melody broke it, her words sharp and cutting. "This is what you wanted, isn't it, Mom? You ruined everything." Kimberly didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the window, haunted by the choices that had led them here. Nolan was gone. Sylvester had walked away. Her children barely looked at her without contempt. For the first time, the full weight of her failures sank into her soul. Far away, Nolan stood on a weathered dock as dawn painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The salty breeze ruffled his hair, carrying with it a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. Harbor's Edge, a quiet coastal town nestled between rolling hills and the ocean, had become his sanctuary. Here, no one asked questions. No one pried. 5 years earlier, Nolan had arrived under a new identity, Jack Miller, shedding the remnants of his former life like a snake shedding its skin. The polished businessman he once was had faded into a memory, replaced by a rugged figure shaped by years of hard, honest work. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Nolan wandered through the bustling town marketplace. The air was fragrant with the aromas of fresh bread and grilled seafood, and cheerful vendors displayed their colorful wares. In this lively crowd, Nolan found solace in his anonymity. At a pottery stall, a vase caught his eye. Its serene blue glaze mirrored the ocean's tranquility. As he reached out to touch it, his hand brushed against someone else's. "Oh, I'm sorry," a soft voice said. Turning, Nolan met the kind eyes of a woman with auburn hair swept into a loose braid. Her warm smile held a gentle radiance. "No need to apologize," he said, his voice steady. "It's a beautiful piece, isn't it?" She nodded, her gaze lingering on the vase. "It is. Simple yet so elegant. The artists here have such a gift." Intrigued, Nolan tilted his head. "You sound like you know something about art." A soft laugh escaped her lips. "Not much. I used to paint a long time ago, but Life has a way of getting in the way, doesn't it? Her words carried a quiet sorrow that resonated with Nolan. Sometimes, he said, surprising himself with the thought, it only takes the right moment to start again. She extended her hand, her smile returning. I'm Lainey. Jack, Nolan replied, shaking her hand. Though the name still felt foreign, it had begun to settle into his identity. They continued talking, wandering through the market together, their conversation flowing effortlessly, like the rhythm of the tide. Lainey often delighted others with tales from her past. It had been 3 years since she arrived in Harbor's Edge, seeking peace and a fresh start after a grueling divorce. She now ran a charming little bookstore nestled in the town's heart and spent her free hours volunteering at the community center. As they strolled along the cobblestone streets, she turned to her companion and asked, So, what about you? What brought you to Harbor's Edge? Nolan paused, his thoughts tangling. He had always been cautious about revealing too much of his history. I needed a change, he finally admitted. City life wasn't working for me anymore. Noticing his hesitance, Lainey chose not to pry further. Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad it did, she said warmly. It's nice to meet someone new. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Nolan found himself spending more time in Lainey's bookstore, drawn not only by her company but also by the cozy, inviting atmosphere. Shelves brimming with books surrounded a snug seating area where visitors could enjoy coffee as they read. One afternoon, while Nolan leafed through a book of classic literature, Lainey approached with a steaming cup in hand. This one's on me, she said with a playful smile. You've become my most loyal customer. Nolan chuckled softly. I think I've read more in the last month than I have in years. Leaning against the counter, Lainey studied him thoughtfully. You're a bit of a mystery, you know, she said. Quiet, reserved, but there's something about you, like you're carrying a weight you don't share. Nolan met her gaze, his expression steady. Everyone has their burdens, he said after a moment. Some of us just carry them more quietly. Her expression softened, and though she didn't push for more, she offered gently, If you ever feel like unpacking them, I'm here. He gave her a small nod, appreciating her understanding. In time, Lainey's warmth began to chip away at the walls Nolan had built. She never pried into his secrets, respecting his boundaries, and gradually, he started sharing fragments of his story. He spoke of his love for the sea, his fondness for fishing, and his appreciation for life's simpler joys. During one evening walk along the beach, Lainey opened up about her own struggles. My ex-husband was challenging, she said carefully, controlling, manipulative. By the time I understood how damaging it all was, I'd already lost so much of myself. Nolan listened intently, his heart heavy with empathy. Walking away from something like that takes incredible courage, he said sincerely. You should be proud of yourself. Lainey's smile was faint but genuine. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever completely heal, if I'll ever be able to trust again. Nolan stopped walking and turned to face her. You will, he said firmly. It just takes time, and the right people. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance an unspoken understanding formed. Both carried scars, but in each other they found a sense of solace. As their connection deepened, Nolan's life in Harbor's Edge began to thrive. He became a familiar figure in town, lending a hand at the docks, volunteering at the food pantry, and teaching kids how to fish. His quiet generosity earned the respect of the townspeople, though no one knew the full extent of his past. One evening, after a lively community event, Lainey invited Nolan over for dinner. Her cottage, much like her, exuded warmth and personality. It was filled with books, plants, and charming personal touches. As they shared a meal, Lainey's demeanor turned serious. Jack, she said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Nolan tensed but nodded. Of course. Do you ever think about going back, to where you came from, to the people you left behind? Her question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Nolan set down his fork, his face unreadable. No, he said finally. There's nothing for me there anymore. My life is here now. Reaching across the table, Lainey gently placed her hand over his. "Whatever happened in your past doesn't define you," she said softly. "You're a good man, Jack, and you deserve to be happy." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For years, he had been burdened by regret, convinced he'd never truly move on. But with Lainey, he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't known in a long time. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." As the evening wore on, Nolan realized he was beginning to find peace for the first time since his life had fallen apart. The shadows of his past still loomed, but now, with Lainey by his side, he felt ready to move forward. Meanwhile, far away from harbor's edge, Kimberly sat in a cramped, dilapidated apartment, gazing out at the bleak city skyline. The luxury penthouse she once called home was now a distant memory, replaced by peeling wallpaper and the incessant drip of a leaky faucet. The stark contrast between her former and current lives gnawed at her daily. Seated at a battered kitchen table, Kimberly buried her face in her hands. Piles of unpaid bills stared back at her, a relentless reminder of her mounting troubles. The utilities were overdue, and her landlord's warnings had turned into outright threats. Catching sight of her reflection in a cracked mirror above the sink, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Her once glossy hair hung limp, and her face was gaunt, etched with lines of worry. Her phone buzzed, sparking a fleeting moment of hope. Perhaps it was Nolan. Perhaps after all this time, he had finally responded to her countless messages. But the screen revealed yet another collection notice. With a bitter laugh, she tossed the phone onto the table. Kimberly's life had crumbled in the wake of betrayal. Sylvester, the man she had foolishly trusted and conspired with, abandoned her a year after Nolan disappeared. When the money dried up, so did Sylvester's affections. "I can't keep living like this," Sylvester had said during their final argument, his voice cold as he packed his belongings. "You're a wreck, and you're dragging me down." "You promised," Kimberly had shouted, her voice breaking. "You said we'd face this together." Sylvester didn't even look back as he walked out the door. "I made promises when there was still something left to hold on to. You can't blame me for wanting out." The door slammed behind him, leaving Kimberly alone in the emptiness of their apartment. Her children, though they were no longer children, wanted nothing to do with her. Taylor, her eldest, had been the first to leave. "I can't even stand the sight of you, Mom," Taylor had said during one of their heated arguments. The words cut deeply, a painful reminder of the bridges Kimberly had burned and the life she had squandered. Taylor's voice struck like a thunderclap, sharp and unyielding. "You've ruined everything. Dad, us, everything." Kimberly reached out, desperation evident in her trembling hands. "I made mistakes, Taylor, but I did it for us, for the family." Taylor's laughter came cold and biting. "No, you did it for yourself. You lied to Dad, betrayed him, and dragged us into the chaos you created. I want nothing to do with you." Without waiting for another word, Taylor turned her back and walked away, leaving Kimberly collapsing under the weight of her sobs. Ethan and Chloe lingered a moment longer, but their silence carried the same judgment. Over the following days, the gap between Kimberly and her children only widened, the bitterness seeping into every conversation. Tensions boiled over one evening when Chloe's frustration erupted like a storm. "Do you even care about what you've done to Dad? Do you feel any guilt at all for lying to him all these years?" Kimberly's voice faltered as she tried to defend herself. "Of course I care. I've made terrible mistakes, but I loved him." "Loved him?" Chloe's voice quivered with anger. "You humiliated him. You shattered him." Ethan, normally reserved, spoke with quiet fury. "Do you even know where Dad is? Have you done anything to make this right?" Kimberly's eyes brimmed with helpless tears. "I've tried everything. Calling, writing, messaging. He won't respond. Maybe he's better off without me." Ethan muttered something under his breath and walked away. Kimberly was left alone, her heart heavy with the weight of their disdain. Her relentless efforts to find Nolan led nowhere. Every search, every phone call, and every email ended in silence. Investigators turned up empty-handed. The world seemed to conspire against her efforts to reconnect. Late one night, Kimberly sat on her bed, her hands trembling as she typed another plea into her phone. "Nolan, please. I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But the kids need you. I need you. Just tell me you're okay." She pressed send, already resigned to the lack of a reply. The crushing silence that followed was unbearable. To dull the pain of her guilt, Kimberly turned to wine. A single glass to soothe her nerves spiraled into a daily escape, the empty bottles stacking up as silent witnesses to her decline. Days bled into nights in a haze, and time lost its meaning. One morning, Chloe barged into the apartment, her face a mask of disgust. "Are you drunk? It's 10 in the morning, Mom." Kimberly's words slurred. "Does it even matter? Nobody cares anymore." Chloe's tone hardened. "You're pathetic. You're not even trying to fix this." Kimberly's voice cracked as she shouted through her tears. "What do you want from me? I've lost everything. Your father won't speak to me. Sylvester's gone, and you and Ethan hate me. What more can I do?" Chloe's response was icy. "I wanted a mother who didn't destroy our family." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. It was the final fracture. Taylor left the state and cut off all contact. Chloe buried herself in work, rarely coming home, while Ethan dropped out of college but stayed out of obligation rather than love. Conversations between Kimberly and her children were rare, often disintegrating into bitter exchanges. One evening, alone in her darkened apartment, the phone rang. For a brief moment, hope flickered. She grabbed it, only to hear the monotone voice of a debt collector. Defeated, she sank into the couch, her mind wandering to the life she had squandered, lavish vacations, glamorous parties, and a family that had once been whole. All lost in pursuit of fleeting moments with Sylvester. Now, she was paying the price. In a last-ditch effort, Kimberly decided to write Nolan a heartfelt letter. "Nolan, I don't know where to start. For 5 years I've carried the burden of my actions, and not a day goes by that I don't regret what I did. I destroyed our family and betrayed your trust. I've lost everything. Sylvester is gone, the kids despise me, and I don't blame them. I deserve their anger, and yours too. But I need you to know how sorry I am. Truly sorry. If there's even a small part of you that can forgive me, even if you never want to see me again, just let me know you're okay. That's all I ask." She sent the letter, unsure if it would even reach him. Weeks passed without a response, though she hadn't truly expected one. Her life continued to unravel. When her apartment went into foreclosure, she moved into a cramped, dingy one-bedroom unit on the outskirts of town. Each passing moment became a reminder of her failures. One rainy evening, sitting by the window and watching raindrops streak the glass, Kimberly whispered to herself, "This is what I deserve. This is my punishment." Yet, despite the despair, a fragile thread of hope lingered. Perhaps someday she could find a way to make amends. One quiet night, aimlessly scrolling through social media, Kimberly froze. A photo of Nolan appeared on her feed. He was standing on a sunlit pier, his arm around a smiling woman. The caption read, "Grateful for new beginnings and unexpected love." The post, shared by a seaside inn, was tagged in a coastal town less than 2 hours away. Kimberly's heart raced as she stared at the screen. Nolan looked different, happier, freer, unburdened. His sun-kissed skin and relaxed smile were a stark contrast to her own despair. Her eyes shifted to the woman by his side. She radiated warmth and natural beauty, a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable. Kimberly's smile wavered, carrying an almost artificial cheerfulness, as though she were wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. Her hands trembled as she gripped her phone, dialing Chloe with an anxious fervor. "Chloe, I found him," she stuttered, her voice faltering under the weight of her words. "Who?" Chloe's voice came through cold and detached, her indifference as sharp as ice. "Your father," Kimberly managed, her breath hitching. "He's living in a little seaside town. He's different, happier." Chloe's sigh was long and filled with irritation. "Mom, leave him alone." "I can't, Chloe. I need to talk to him. I have to make things right," Kimberly implored, her voice breaking. "No, Mom," Chloe snapped, cutting her off. "He doesn't want to be found. He made that perfectly clear." Kimberly's voice cracked. "But what about you? And Ethan? Don't you want your father back in your lives?" "We're fine without him," Chloe shot back, her tone harsh. You're the one who can't move on, not us. The line went dead, leaving Kimberly to sit in the oppressive quiet that followed. Her daughter's words rang in her ears, but instead of extinguishing her resolve, they only fueled it further. The drive to the coastal town stretched on interminably, the rain pounding against her windshield as she clutched the wheel with a white-knuckled grip. Her thoughts swirled with imagined confessions and desperate attempts to bridge the chasm she had created. Flashes of her past mistakes haunted her: Sylvester's smug grin, Nolan's devastated expression, and the disappointed looks on her children's faces. She had torn their lives apart, but a faint glimmer of hope remained that Nolan's heart might still hold a shred of forgiveness. When the storm finally abated, Kimberly arrived at a picturesque seaside village. The salty tang of the ocean filled the air as she parked near the pier, clutching a photograph she had stumbled upon earlier. The image had led her here, to a quaint bookstore with a weathered sign above the door. As she stepped inside, a bell chimed softly. There he was. Nolan stood behind the counter, speaking warmly to a customer. His hair was shorter now, peppered with gray, and his demeanor exuded a serene contentment. His laughter, unguarded and genuine, reached her ears for the first time in years. Kimberly froze, unprepared for the sight of him so at ease. As the customer exited, Nolan turned toward the shelves, arranging books with a quiet grace. Summoning her courage, Kimberly took a tentative step forward. "Nolan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stilled, his hands lingering over the books. Slowly he turned to face her, his eyes briefly betraying surprise before settling into a guarded neutrality. "Kimberly," he said flatly, "why are you here?" His calm tone unsettled her. She had expected anger, perhaps even tears, but not this composed detachment. "I saw a photo," she began, her words faltering. "I needed to come." Nolan's arms crossed over his chest. "Why?" Kimberly swallowed hard. "I wanted to see you, to explain, to apologize. I've been trying to reach you." "And I've been avoiding you," Nolan interjected, his voice firm. "Deliberately." Tears pricked at Kimberly's eyes as she stepped closer. "Please, Nolan. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't keep living like this. I've lost everything." "That's not my concern," Nolan replied, his words cutting. Kimberly flinched at his bluntness. "The kids miss you. They need you. I need you." A bitter laugh escaped Nolan's lips. "The kids? The same ones who called me a failure? Who believed your lies over the truth? No, Kimberly. They're better off without me. So are you." Kimberly collapsed to her knees, her sobs breaking free. "Please, Nolan. I know I made unforgivable mistakes, but we shared 25 years together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Nolan's gaze remained steady, his voice low but resolute. "It meant everything to me, and you destroyed it." Her cries grew louder. "I was selfish, I know, but I loved you, Nolan. I still do." "Stop," he said sharply, his tone firm. "Don't say that. You didn't love me. You loved the security I provided, the house, the lifestyle, the comfort. And when that wasn't enough, you chose him." Kimberly shook her head frantically. "No, it wasn't like that. It was a terrible mistake." Nolan's voice turned cold. "You don't accidentally betray someone for years, Kimberly." The door creaked open, and a woman entered carrying a basket of groceries. She paused, her eyes flicking between Kimberly on the floor and Nolan standing rigid behind the counter. "Is everything all right?" the woman asked, her voice calm but wary. Nolan's expression softened as he turned toward her. "Just someone from my past," he said quietly. Kimberly's gaze darted between them. "Is this her? The woman from the picture?" The newcomer stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Nolan's arm. "I'm Lainey," she said simply. Kimberly's heart sank. She saw the way Nolan looked at Lainey, with trust, respect, and a quiet affection that had never been present in their marriage. "Nolan, please," Kimberly begged, her voice cracking. "Give me a chance to make this right." Nolan shook his head slowly. "There's nothing left to fix. You and Sylvester made your choices, Kimberly. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away. I've spent years rebuilding my life, and I won't let you destroy it again." Lainey offered Nolan a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "I'll give you two a moment," she said before stepping outside. Once the door closed, Nolan's voice hardened. "This is the last time we're having this conversation, Kimberly. You need to let go. Focus on the life you have left, because I've moved on." Kimberly wiped at her tears, the anguish on her face morphing into anger. "You can't just erase 25 years, Nolan." "I didn't erase it," he replied firmly. "You did." He walked to the door and held it open, waiting. Without another word, Kimberly rose, her heart shattering all over again as she stepped out into the rain. "Goodbye, Kimberly." The words lingered like an unspoken echo, leaving her motionless, her breath catching unevenly. She wanted to respond, but deep within, she recognized the finality. Rising on unsteady legs, she turned away, her movements heavy with resignation. The soft click of the door shutting behind her marked the end. Now, standing on the sidewalk, the weight of closure pressed down on her. Through the window she glimpsed Nolan's laughter with Lainey, their shared happiness a sharp wound. The life she had fractured was now Nolan's to restore, and he had found someone new to share it with. Kimberly drove back to the city in silence, the bitter words of their argument looping in her mind. Nolan's voice, firm and cold, rang like a verdict. "You made your choices, Kimberly." The harsh truth was inescapable. For years, she had clung to the fragile hope of mending what had broken, but the reality was now glaringly clear. Nolan was gone, and she was left to face the consequences of her own decisions. The city welcomed her with its usual apathy: gray skies, the blare of horns, and the ceaseless flow of indifferent strangers. Her apartment, a claustrophobic one-bedroom in a decrepit building, was a stark contrast to the lavish life she had once known. Inside, she was greeted by peeling wallpaper and the faint odor of mildew. She collapsed onto the edge of her bed, her gaze falling on a pile of unopened bills stacked haphazardly on the coffee table. Her eyes drifted to a collection of photographs she had salvaged: Nolan holding baby Chloe, Ethan grinning after a victorious soccer game, and herself in the center, glowing and seemingly content. The memories stirred a painful mix of sorrow and resolve. That night, Kimberly made a pivotal decision. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still within her grasp. If only she could muster the strength to rebuild. The next morning, she walked into a community center and asked to meet with someone in charge. Margie, the coordinator, a perceptive woman with kind eyes, studied Kimberly as she explained her intentions. "So, you want to volunteer?" Margie asked, her tone skeptical. "Yes," Kimberly answered, her hands twisting nervously. "I need to do something meaningful, to make amends for the mistakes I've made." Margie leaned back, appraising her carefully. "We're always in need of help. Food banks, shelters, outreach programs. But I'll be honest, it's tough work. No recognition, no quick fixes. Are you prepared for that?" Kimberly's response was resolute. "I am." Thus began her journey toward redemption. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. She spent countless hours organizing donations, assembling food parcels, and scrubbing shelter floors. But the stories of those she encountered left an even deeper impression. Homeless mothers struggling to provide for their children, veterans neglected by the system, and young people trapped in the clutches of addiction. Each story chipped away at her self-pity. One evening at a soup kitchen, Kimberly met Teresa, a weary woman accompanied by her two sons. As Teresa recounted her trials, a shattered marriage, financial collapse, and betrayal by someone she had trusted, her voice quivered. "It blindsided me," Teresa said, her hands trembling as she served herself mashed potatoes. "One day everything seemed fine. The next he was gone and he took everything with him." Kimberly felt her throat tighten. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. Teresa managed a faint smile. "It's hard, but my boys keep me going. You can't live in the past. You just have to keep moving forward." Her words struck a deep chord within Kimberly. She thought of Chloe and Ethan, now distant and estranged. Perhaps it wasn't too late to try to mend those bonds, even if only to express regret. Meanwhile, Nolan's new life by the sea flourished. His relationship with Lainey had grown into a partnership built on trust and understanding. One evening, as they walked along the shore, Lainey slipped her hand into his. "You seem lighter these days," she observed, her voice warm. Nolan met her gaze, his expression peaceful. "I think I've finally let go of the anger. For a long time it felt like it was all I had left. But now—" He looked toward the horizon where the waves rolled steadily. "Now, I don't need it anymore." Lainey's smile widened as she squeezed his hand. "You've come a long way. I'm proud of you." Her words filled him with gratitude. With her support, he no longer felt defined by the pain of the past. Together, they opened a small bookstore, where Nolan spent his days surrounded by the stories he loved. Lainey launched a community art initiative, fostering creativity and connection. Their lives intertwined with the rhythm of the town, bringing joy in small, meaningful ways, shared meals, quiet nights, and the laughter of newfound friends. Back in the city, Kimberly's work at the community center gradually restored her sense of self-worth. One day, she received an unexpected call from Chloe. "Mom," Chloe began hesitantly, "I heard you've been volunteering. Is that true?" Kimberly's heart surged. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "I've been trying to do something worthwhile, something that matters." A long silence followed before Chloe spoke again. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I hope you're serious about it." "I am," Kimberly replied, her voice earnest. "I know I've hurt you and Ethan deeply, more than I can ever make up for. But I want to try. I want to be someone you can respect." Chloe's tone softened. "It'll take time, Mom, but I'm glad you're trying." The call ended, leaving Kimberly with a glimmer of hope. It was a small but significant step toward healing the fractured ties with her children. Over time, her work at the shelters and food drives evolved from an act of atonement to a true calling. She no longer dwelled on her losses, choosing instead to focus on the lives she could touch. One rainy evening, as she walked home, she lifted her face to the sky, letting the droplets cleanse her. For the first time in years, she felt an inner peace, not because she had been forgiven, but because she had learned to forgive herself. In the seaside town, Nolan sat on the porch with Lainey at his side. Together, they watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky with warm hues of orange and pink. "Do you ever think about the past?" Lainey asked quietly. "Sometimes," Nolan admitted, "but not the way I used to. It's more like a reminder of how far I've come." Lainey smiled gently. "And where you're going?" Taking her hand, he held it firmly, his grip steady. "Yeah." Where was he headed? As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nolan felt an unfamiliar yet soothing sense of contentment settle over him. His life was far from perfect, but it was undeniably his, a life painstakingly rebuilt with resilience, love, and unyielding effort. The fading sunlight painted golden patterns across the walls of his coastal home, where he sat on the porch, nursing a warm cup of coffee. In the yard, Lainey tended their flourishing garden, her cheerful laughter blending with the gentle murmur of the sea breeze as she conversed with their neighbor. After years of turmoil, life had finally found a steady, tranquil rhythm. It was during the unremarkable task of sorting through an old storage box that Nolan stumbled upon a sealed envelope he didn't recall ever seeing before. The envelope, its edges frayed and paper yellowed with time, bore handwriting that was unmistakably Sylvester's. His breath caught as he read the name scrawled across the front, his own. For years, Sylvester's name had been synonymous with betrayal and deceit in Nolan's mind, a name that evoked only anger and bitterness. The temptation to throw the letter away surged within him, yet an inexplicable curiosity rooted him in place. With hesitant hands, he broke the seal and unfolded the brittle paper. The letter began simply, "Nolan, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here. There are truths I should have shared long ago. It's too late for me to make things right, but you deserve to know." Nolan's stomach twisted as he continued to read. "I lied to you about everything. About the kids, about Kimberly, about it all. You were always the better man, Nolan. Your hard work, your integrity, I envied you for it. My affair with Kimberly wasn't born of love, not for her and certainly not for me. It was driven by jealousy and spite. I wanted to take something from you, to bring you down to my level. The cruelest thing I ever did was convincing her to make you believe the children weren't yours. I knew the lie would destroy you. But here is the truth. Chloe and Ethan are your children. They always were. I can never undo the pain I caused, but I hope this truth offers you some peace. I'm sorry. Sylvester. Nolan's hands shook as he lowered the letter, his vision blurring with tears. His chest felt tight, as though the weight of years of anguish and falsehoods had suddenly collapsed upon him. For so long, he had believed a devastating lie, a lie that had poisoned his relationship with his children and torn apart his world. The revelation felt both liberating and suffocating. Needing to escape, he rose abruptly and strode toward the beach. Lainey appeared in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Nolan?" she called softly. "I need some air," he murmured, brushing past her. The cool sand shifted beneath his feet as he walked along the shore, the crumpled letter clutched tightly in his hand. The rhythmic crash of the waves failed to drown out the torrent of memories flooding his mind. Chloe's hesitant first steps, Ethan's triumphant graduation, family vacations now tainted by the shadow of deceit. Years of estrangement played like a haunting melody in his head. He had pushed his children away, convinced by Sylvester's cruel words that they weren't his. Anger bubbled up within him, anger at Sylvester, at Kimberly, and most painfully, at himself for believing the lies. But beneath the anger lay something even heavier: regret. By the time he returned home, the weight of his emotions had exhausted him. Sitting on the porch, the letter lay on the table as Lainey quietly joined him. "It's from Sylvester," he said at last, his voice hoarse. Lainey frowned. "What does it say?" "He lied," Nolan answered, struggling to keep his voice steady. "About the kids, Chloe and Ethan. They're mine, they were always mine." Lainey placed a comforting hand on his arm. "What are you going to do?" The question weighed heavily on him. "I need to tell them. I need to try to fix this." Reaching out to Chloe and Ethan after so many years felt like an insurmountable task. Nolan feared rejection, but he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He began with Chloe, sending a tentative email. "Chloe, it's been a long time and I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to tell you something I just discovered. Something I should have known all along. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. Dad." 2 days later, her response arrived. "Dad, I'm not sure what to say, but I'm willing to hear you out. Let me know when and where. Chloe." They met at a quiet cafe in the city. Nolan arrived early, his nerves stretched taut. When Chloe walked in, he was struck by how much she had changed. She carried herself with a quiet confidence he barely recognized. "Hi," she greeted, sliding into the chair across from him. "Hi," Nolan replied, emotion thickening his voice. "Thank you for coming." Chloe's expression was guarded. "What is this about?" Wordlessly, Nolan slid the letter across the table. She hesitated before picking it up, her face shifting as she read, confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. "So it was all a lie?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You thought we weren't yours because of this?" Nolan nodded, his guilt almost unbearable. "I believed it, and I let it destroy everything. I'm so sorry, Chloe, for all of it." She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You should have come to us. You should have talked to us. We didn't understand why you left, why you shut us out. It hurt." "I know," Nolan said, his voice breaking. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right, if you'll let me." Chloe wiped her eyes and gave a small, tentative nod. "I think I'd like that." Reconnecting with Ethan proved more difficult. His anger was palpable when they finally met. "You walked away," Ethan said bluntly. "You didn't even try." "You're right," Nolan admitted. "I let my pain blind me and I made choices I regret every day. But you're my son, Ethan, and I'm here now. I want to fix this." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." "I know," Nolan said, "but I'm not going anywhere this time." Though Ethan's initial response was cautious, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. "We'll see," he said finally. Rebuilding the fractured bonds with Chloe and Ethan was a slow and arduous process. Years of pain couldn't be erased overnight, but small victories, a shared meal with Chloe, a heartfelt conversation with Ethan, began to chip away at the barriers. Little by little, their relationships started to mend. For Nolan, the journey was both harrowing and redemptive. Though he couldn't undo the past, he worked tirelessly to build a future filled with honesty and love. The moments when Chloe and Ethan welcomed him back into their lives brought a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Nolan and Lainey sat together on the porch, he recounted the journey of Sylvester's confession and his efforts to reconnect with his children. "You've come so far," Lainey said, her eyes shining with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Nolan replied, squeezing her hand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Nolan felt a profound sense of peace. Though his path had been marred by pain and betrayal, it had ultimately led him back to love and redemption. And for the first time in years, he felt truly at home. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.